Hello there, and welcome to this quiet corner of history. Before we begin our journey tonight, I want to take a moment to greet you wherever you are in the world. Whether you are lying in the dark with your eyes already heavy, or sitting somewhere peaceful with a warm drink in your hands, I am so glad you chose to spend this hour here. If you would like, leave a comment and tell me where in the world you are listening from and what time of day it is for you right now. It is always a wonderful thing to see how far this community of quiet history lovers stretches. And if this style of slow, immersive storytelling is something you enjoy, please do consider subscribing so you never miss another journey into the past. But now, let us allow the noise of the modern world to slowly fade. Let your breathing settle. Let your thoughts grow still. Because tonight, we are traveling back to one of the most powerful, most extravagant, and most deeply disturbing civilizations the world has ever produced. We are going to ancient Rome, and we are going to look quietly and carefully at the men who sat at its very center, the emperors. Over the next hour or so, we will be exploring the fascinating and often deeply unsettling world of the Roman emperors. We will walk through their vast palace complexes, witness their extraordinary displays of power, and confront the darker truths that lay beneath the marble and the gold. We will meet men who declared themselves gods, men who murdered their own families without hesitation, men who spent fortunes on pleasures so extreme they beggar belief, and men who ruled with a cruelty so systematic it became almost routine. We will encounter figures whose names have echoed down through the centuries. Augustus, the architect of empire. Caligula, whose brief and catastrophic reign became a byword for madness. Nero, who watched his city burn and whose memory the Romans themselves tried to erase. Domitian, who demanded to be addressed as Lord and God. And Commodus, who believed himself to be the reincarnation of Hercules and forced the entire Roman Senate to agree with him. By the end of our journey, you will have a richer and more complicated understanding of what it meant to wear the purple in ancient Rome, of the heights and the depths that absolute power could reach, and of the endlessly human story that runs beneath even the most extreme of historical circumstances. So dim the lights, settle in, and let the distant world of Rome softly carry you away. Part 1. The making of an emperor. To understand the Roman emperors, we must first understand something about what Rome was before they existed. For centuries, Rome had been a republic, governed by elected magistrates, a senate of aristocrats, and a complex web of laws and traditions designed specifically to prevent any one man from accumulating too much power. The Romans were deeply, almost obsessively suspicious of kings. Their founding mythology included the expulsion of a tyrannical king named Tarquinius Superbus, Tarquin the Proud, and for 500 years after that, the very word rex, king, was treated in Rome as a kind of obscenity. And yet, by the 1st century before the Common Era, the Republic was tearing itself apart. Civil wars erupted with increasing frequency. Generals with loyal armies and political ambitions competed for supremacy. The Senate, designed to be a body of collective wisdom, had become a theater of factional rivalry and occasional assassination. The old system was failing, and Rome was enormous now, stretching from Spain in the west to Syria in the east, an empire in territory, if not yet in name. Into this instability stepped Julius Caesar, a man of brilliant military genius and bottomless political ambition. Caesar crossed the Rubicon, defeated his rivals, and made himself dictator perpetuo, dictator in perpetuity. The Senate killed him for it on the Ides of March in 44 BCE, 23 stab wounds on the floor of a theater, the conspirators convinced they had saved the Republic. They had not. What followed was another generation of civil war, culminating in the victory of Caesar's adopted son Octavian, who defeated Mark Antony and Cleopatra at the Battle of Actium in 31 BCE and emerged as the undisputed master of the Roman world. He was 29 years old. Octavian understood something that Julius Caesar had not, or perhaps had simply ignored. The Romans would not accept a king. They would not accept a dictator. But they might accept something more subtle, something that looked like the Republic while functioning as an autocracy. And so Octavian constructed a fiction of extraordinary sophistication. He called himself simply the Princeps, the first citizen. He kept the Senate, kept the magistracies, kept all the old forms of the Republic, while quietly arranging things so that real power resided entirely with himself. The Senate, grateful for the end of the civil wars and deeply aware of which way the wind was blowing, rewarded him with a new name, Augustus, the revered one, a word with religious connotations, suggesting something set apart from ordinary humanity, touched by the divine. The empire had begun. Part 2. A day in the life of a Roman emperor. To understand what it meant to be a Roman emperor at the height of the empire, let us imagine a day in the life of one of the more stable and capable occupants of the throne. Let us say it is the reign of the Emperor Hadrian in the 2nd century of the Common Era. Dawn breaks over the Palatine Hill in Rome, where the imperial palace, the Palatium, sprawls across the hilltop in a complex so vast it has given its name to all palaces everywhere in every language that descends from Latin. The emperor rises early, as he always does. He is a man of remarkable energy and discipline, unusual among emperors, and his household has learned to keep pace with him or suffer the consequences. His mornings begin with a greeting ceremony that would strike us today as almost inconceivably elaborate. A queue of visitors, some of whom have been waiting since before sunrise, files through to pay their respects. Senators, military officers, petitioners, ambassadors from distant kingdoms, representatives of provincial cities, philosophers seeking patronage, poets hoping for recognition. Each must be received, acknowledged, answered. The emperor listens, advises, decides, dismisses. The weight of an empire passes through these hours in a steady stream of human need and political calculation. After the morning reception, there are documents, hundreds of them. The Roman imperial bureaucracy generated paperwork with extraordinary enthusiasm. Reports from governors, legal appeals from citizens who had exhausted every other avenue, military dispatches from the frontiers, financial accounts, building proposals, requests for the emperor's personal decision on matters that no one else felt qualified to resolve. The emperor was the final authority in the Roman world, which meant that the Roman world kept asking him things. In the afternoons, there might be public appearances. The emperor processing through the city, his passage marked by soldiers and cheering crowds, or visits to temples where the elaborate religious duties of the office demanded that he perform sacrifices and rituals that kept the gods favorable to Rome. The emperor was Pontifex Maximus, the chief priest of the Roman state religion, And this was not a ceremonial title. It came with genuine religious obligations, a daily round of spiritual maintenance for an empire of millions. And beneath all of this, beneath the ceremony and the paperwork and the public appearances, there was always the awareness that did not leave, the knowledge that could never quite be set aside, that previous emperors had been killed, that the people surrounding him, the advisors, the guards, the senators with their careful smiles, might at any moment become his executioners, that the purple robe he wore, which in Rome was the color of blood as much as of royalty, was simultaneously the most coveted and most dangerous garment in the world. Being emperor of Rome was an extraordinary thing. It was also, in many ways, a terrifying one. Part 3. The God Emperor. Perhaps no aspect of the Roman emperor's position is more alien to modern sensibilities than the question of his divinity. For the Romans, the boundary between human and divine was not the sharp and impassable line it became in later monotheistic traditions. Gods could intervene in human affairs. Exceptional humans could, after death, and sometimes before it, ascend to divine status. The gap between the two was a matter of degree rather than kind. Augustus was careful about this during his lifetime. He allowed himself to be worshipped as a god in the eastern provinces, where such divine rulership had deep roots going back to the pharaohs of Egypt and the god-kings of the Hellenistic world. But in Rome itself, he was more circumspect, accepting divine honors with what appeared to be modesty, deflecting claims of divinity onto his adoptive father Julius Caesar, who was formally deified by the Senate after his death. After Augustus died in 14 CE, having ruled for 41 years and transformed Rome beyond recognition, the Senate voted to deify him. He became Divus Augustus, the divine Augustus, and temples were built in his honor. This set a precedent. Most emperors who were not actively despised by the Senate received deification after their deaths. It became, in a sense, the standard retirement package for a successful emperor. But some emperors were not content to wait until death for their divine status. This is where things become significantly more interesting and considerably more disturbing. The Emperor Caligula, who ruled from 37 to 41 CE, began his reign with extraordinary promise. He was the son of the beloved general Germanicus, and when he took the throne at 24 after the deeply unpopular reign of Tiberius, Rome celebrated in the streets. Hundreds of thousands of animals were sacrificed in thanksgiving. Bonfires burned across the empire. It seemed as though the nightmare was over. Within a year, everything had changed. Exactly what happened to Caligula in the first months of his reign is a matter of historical debate. Ancient sources describe a severe illness early in his rule that some historians have suggested may have caused brain damage. Others believe that the power simply revealed what was always there. What is certain is that the emperor who emerged from that illness was a profoundly different figure from the one who had entered it. Caligula declared himself a living god, not a future god, not a divine emperor in the carefully hedged Eastern sense. A god now, present, walking among men. He reportedly dressed as various deities, appearing in public wearing the attributes of Jupiter or Hercules or Mercury or the goddess Venus, depending on his mood. He had a bridge built across the Bay of Naples, 2 miles of boats lashed together and covered with soil, so that he could ride across the sea as a god might. The ancient sources, who are admittedly not always reliable, claim that he sometimes stood beside the statue of Jupiter Capitolinus and whispered into the god's ear, holding conversations with the divine on equal terms. The Senate, accustomed to treating imperial eccentricity with careful public deference, found ways to accommodate these performances. When Caligula demanded that a golden statue of himself be placed inside the temple in Jerusalem, the Jewish population of the empire came to the edge of open rebellion. The crisis was only resolved by the diplomacy of the Jewish king Agrippa I, who managed to convince Caligula to rescind the order, and then by the emperor's assassination in January of 41 CE, which rendered the whole question academic. Caligula ruled for less than 4 years. In that time, he spent the enormous treasury surplus left by Tiberius, executed or humiliated a large portion of the Roman aristocracy, made his horse a consul according to some accounts, though this may be later embellishment, and demonstrated with terrible clarity what happened when the absolute power of the Roman emperor was wielded without restraint or judgment. He was killed by officers of his own guard. He was 28 years old. Part 4. Nero and the Burning of Rome. Of all the Roman emperors, none has captured the imagination of subsequent centuries quite like Nero. Born Lucius Domitius Ahenobarbus in 37 CE, he became emperor at 16 after his mother Agrippina the Younger maneuvered with extraordinary skill to secure the throne for her son following the death of the Emperor Claudius. Whether she poisoned Claudius is uncertain. The Romans certainly suspected she did. The early years of Nero's reign were, by the standards of what followed, relatively stable. He was guided by the philosopher Seneca and the praetorian prefect Burrus, two men of considerable ability who kept the worst of his impulses in check and allowed the machinery of government to function. The Senate later looked back on this period as a kind of golden age. But Nero had appetites that no amount of wise counsel could permanently contain. He was passionate about the arts, particularly music and theater, pursuits that a Roman emperor was absolutely not supposed to pursue with personal enthusiasm. The aristocratic ideal of the Roman ruler was martial and political, a warrior and a statesman. An emperor who performed on stage was making a category error of almost cosmic proportions in the Roman value system. Nero performed on stage. He performed at length. He competed in Greek games. He wrote poetry. He drove racing chariots. He did all the things that Roman aristocrats found most embarrassing in a ruler, and he did them with visible pleasure. He also, over time, disposed of the people he found inconvenient. His mother Agrippina, whose political ambitions had not dimmed after putting her son on the throne, became increasingly difficult. Nero tried to kill her by sending her on a boat designed to collapse at sea. She survived by swimming to shore. He then sent soldiers to her villa, where she was stabbed to death. When he heard that she was dead, he reportedly examined her body and made comments about her physical appearance. She was his mother. His first wife, Octavia, was divorced and then executed. His second wife, Poppaea, was killed, according to the ancient sources, when Nero kicked her while she was pregnant. Whether this was accident or murder is unclear. What is clear is that she died, and that Nero then had her embalmed and deified. And then there was the fire. In July of 64 CE, a fire broke out in Rome. It burned for 6 days before being brought partially under control, then reignited and burned for another 3. When it was finally over, 3 of Rome's 14 districts had been completely destroyed, and 7 more were severely damaged. Hundreds of thousands of people were left homeless. The question of who started the fire has never been definitively answered. The ancient sources disagree. Some claim Nero started it deliberately to clear space for a vast new palace complex he wished to build, the Domus Aurea, the Golden House, which did indeed rise on the cleared land afterward. The most famous account, that Nero played the fiddle while Rome burned, is almost certainly false in its literal details, not least because the fiddle had not been invented. But the image captured something real about how Romans felt about their emperor's relationship to the catastrophe. Whether or not Nero started the fire, he needed someone to blame for it. He chose the Christians, a small and not yet particularly prominent sect in Rome, and subjected them to persecutions that became legendary in early Christian memory. They were burned alive as human torches. They were thrown to wild animals in the arena. They were crucified. Among those executed during this persecution, according to later Christian tradition, were the apostles Peter and Paul. Nero's reign ended not in assassination, but in flight and suicide. When the Senate and the provincial governors finally moved against him, he fled Rome and killed himself in 68 CE, reportedly saying with his last breath that the world was losing a great artist. He was 30 years old. Part 5. Domitian, Lord and God. The Emperor Domitian, who ruled from 81 to 96 CE, represents perhaps the most systematic attempt by a Roman emperor to institutionalize his own divinity. Where Caligula had been erratic and theatrical about his claims to godhood, Domitian was methodical. He required that official correspondence to him begin with the formula Dominus et Deus Noster, our Lord and God. He filled Rome with statues of himself. He demanded that senators address him with elaborate formulas of submission. He had the month of October renamed Domitianus in his honor, just as July and August had been named for Julius Caesar and Augustus. He was also, by the standards of Roman administration, a competent emperor. His financial management was careful. His military policies were generally sound. He oversaw an extensive building program in Rome. The ancient sources, mostly written by senators who loathed him, emphasize his cruelty and his paranoia. Modern historians have sometimes been more charitable, suggesting that the picture of Domitian as a monster was partly constructed by the very class of people he had spent his reign intimidating. The intimidation was real, however. Domitian executed senators. He banished philosophers who had an annoying tendency to discuss tyranny in public. He created an atmosphere of surveillance and suspicion in which informers prospered and the powerful lived in fear of one another. His court was a place of elaborate ceremonial submission, where even the highest aristocrats were expected to perform acts of deference that would have been unthinkable a generation earlier. He was killed in September of 96 CE by a conspiracy that included members of his own household. His wife Domitia, who had good reason to believe she was next on his list of people to be eliminated, is believed to have been involved in the plot. A freedman named Stephanus stabbed him, and the Praetorian Guard, bought off in advance by the conspirators, allowed it to happen. The Senate celebrated. They ordered his name erased from public monuments throughout the empire, his statues smashed, his memory officially condemned. The Romans had a formal procedure for this, which they called damnatio memoriae, the condemnation of memory. It was as close as a society without computers or photography could come to erasing a person from history. It never quite worked. The erased names left outlines in stone. The smashed statues left empty pedestals. And Domitian himself remained in the historical record, preserved in amber by the very hatred of those who condemned him, too useful as a cautionary tale to be entirely forgotten. Part 6. Commodus, the gladiator emperor. If Caligula represents the madness of absolute power corrupting a young man overnight, and Domitian represents its slow, systematic distortion of a more calculated mind, then Commodus, who ruled from 180 to 192 CE, represents something else again, something almost theatrical. A man who turned the entire Roman Empire into a stage for his own fantasies. Commodus was the son of the philosopher-emperor Marcus Aurelius, one of the most admired rulers in Roman history. A man who spent his nights writing philosophical meditations on duty, humility, and the transience of earthly things. His son appears to have read none of them. From relatively early in his reign, Commodus became convinced that he was the reincarnation of Hercules. This was not a casual metaphor. He dressed in a lion skin and carried a club, the traditional attributes of the mythological hero. He renamed Rome Colonia Commodiana, the colony of Commodus. He renamed the Roman legions after himself. He renamed the months of the year after himself. He gave himself a string of divine titles that grew longer and more elaborate as the years went on. And then there was the arena. Commodus did not merely watch gladiatorial combat as entertainment, as all emperors did. He participated in it. He descended into the arena himself, dressed as a gladiator, and fought. The ancient sources are careful to note that the contests were arranged so that he could not possibly lose. His opponents were given wooden swords. Wounded animals were selected for him to dispatch with theatrical ease. The whole performance was scripted, a vast, expensive theater of imperial self-glorification. But the senators who were required to watch were not permitted to show any amusement or contempt. They had to cheer. They had to applaud. They had to announce, with expressions of apparently sincere enthusiasm, that the emperor, commander of all the armies of Rome, master of the known world, was also an incomparable gladiator. Some of them must have found this deeply trying. He was strangled in his bath on the last day of 192 CE by a wrestler named Narcissus, who had been hired by conspirators that included the emperor's own mistress, his chamberlain, and the praetorian prefect. His body was dragged through the streets and thrown into the Tiber. His memory was condemned by the Senate. He was 31 years old. Part 7. The Price of Purple. The history of the Roman emperors is, in many ways, a history of what happens when a single human being is removed from every constraint that normally shapes human behavior. The laws that govern ordinary people did not govern the emperor, not in practice. The social expectations that moderate ordinary behavior did not apply to him. The financial limits that force ordinary people to weigh their desires against their resources were absent. And the consequences that ordinarily follow from poor choices could, for a while, be deflected onto others. What we see in the emperors, in their excesses and their eccentricities and their cruelties, is humanity operating without its usual guardrails. And what we find is not entirely surprising, though it is often disturbing. We find vanity on a colossal scale. We find the inflation of ordinary desires into extraordinary obsessions. we find a tendency to interpret every disagreement as betrayal, every criticism as conspiracy. We find men who began as human beings and gradually, under the pressure of absolute power and universal flattery, ceased to function as human beings in any meaningful sense. But we also find other things. We find Augustus building an empire that would endure for centuries and writing his own modest account of his achievements with careful rhetorical skill. We find Hadrian traveling to every province of his empire and involving himself in the details of its management with genuine intellectual curiosity. We find Marcus Aurelius fighting wars he found deeply distasteful and writing philosophy in his tent at night, trying to remain, under the most difficult possible circumstances, a good man. The purple robe was not simply a symbol of power. It was a weight. It pressed down on those who wore it with a force that was physical as much as metaphorical. The ancient sources record emperor after emperor who was visibly transformed by the office, who aged quickly, who became paranoid, who struggled with sleep, who found it increasingly difficult to trust anyone around them. Power protected them from most human sufferings. It inflicted upon them a different set of sufferings of its own. Part 8. The End of Emperors. The Roman Empire did not end neatly. It frayed at the edges over centuries, contracting and fragmenting and reforming under pressure from external enemies and internal instability. The western half of the empire fell to the pressure of migrating peoples in 476 CE. Though Romans at the time would not have described it that way, would not have recognized that moment as the end of anything in particular. The eastern half, which we now call the Byzantine Empire, continued for nearly another 1,000 years, its emperors sitting in Constantinople and ruling in the name of Rome, long after Rome itself had become a city of ruins and medieval churches built from ancient marble. The last emperor of the Eastern Empire, Constantine XI, died fighting on the walls of Constantinople in May of 1453, when the Ottoman armies of Sultan Mehmed II finally broke through. He removed his imperial insignia before the last battle, fighting as an ordinary soldier. His body was never conclusively identified. From Augustus to Constantine XI is nearly 15 centuries. In that time, Rome produced emperors of extraordinary variety, saints and monsters, philosophers and fools, military geniuses and men who never left their palaces, men who expanded the empire and men who presided over its contraction, men who built and men who destroyed, men who remembered that they were human and men who forgot. Their faces look back at us from marble busts in museums across the world, rendered with the naturalism that Roman sculptors achieved and lost and the world had to rediscover. The eyes are empty now, the color long since faded. But the faces are specific, individual, recognizably human. This one has a weak chin. That one's nose was broken at some point. This one has the beginning of jowls, the first sign of the comfortable middle age he did not live to complete. They were extraordinary people in extraordinary circumstances. They were also, beneath the purple and the gold, people, afraid of death, hungry for approval, uncertain sometimes in the small hours of the night about what they were doing and why, looking into the darkness from the highest point in the world, with no one to tell them honestly what they needed to hear. We will never fully understand them. But perhaps that is not quite the right goal. Perhaps the right goal is simply to remember them, with all their contradictions intact. to resist both the temptation to make them monsters and the temptation to make them heroes, to see them as clearly as the distance of centuries allows, as human beings in whom the possibilities of human nature were played out on the largest possible stage. And with that, dear listener, we come to the end of our journey through the lives of the Roman emperors. I hope that these stories of power and madness and occasional greatness have given you something to carry with you into sleep, something to wonder about in the dark. As always, if you have enjoyed this quiet journey through the past, I would be grateful if you would subscribe and share these stories with someone else who might enjoy them. But for now, let Rome fade. Let the marble cool and the torches dim. Let the roar of the crowd in the Colosseum grow distant and soft, and let yourself drift, slowly and gently, into the dark. The emperors are long gone. The empire is dust and memory, and the roots of languages still spoken today. And you are here, warm and safe, at the end of another day. Good night. Sleep well. And I will see you next time for another quiet journey into history. Sweet dreams.